The story of the global order continues, with Part 3, the Napoleonic Wars. If you've grabbed your tea or coffee and are ready for another thrilling journey through one of history's most turbulent eras, let's begin. To characterize the Napoleonic Wars simply as a long and large-scale European conflict would be a significant interpretive error. When the Napoleonic Wars concluded, the global system would continue under a new order established under the leadership of a single superpower, the British Empire. The period encompassing the Napoleonic Wars is a highly critical interlude for human history. The Haitian Revolution, the first significant war of independence, the prohibition of slavery, the Louisiana Purchase, marking the first step in the evolution of the young American Republic from a local state of 13 former colonies, states, into a major power. The emergence of the Industrial Revolution, and the integration of Adam Smith's teachings on modern capitalism into daily life. Just as the relentless struggles between France and Britain in the 1675 to 1815 period created the British Empire as the sole superpower, much later, the fierce competition between the US and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1990 allowed the United States to emerge as the single superpower. The principles behind the formation of NATO after 1945 and the principles used by the British Empire between 1675 and 1815 to restrain France alongside its European allies were fundamentally based on the same foundation. Napoleon Bonaparte was not only one of the greatest generals in history, but also a great statesman. The Napoleonic Code, Code Napoleon, Code Civil des Français, that he implemented in France has significantly contributed to the legal and bureaucratic foundations of continental Europe today. Napoleon's dismantling of the French Republic, born of the French Revolution, was not based on a simple imperial ideal. The First French Empire combined the gains achieved for the people by the French Revolution with the strengths of the Ancien Régime, the Old French Kingdom, the centralized state structure created by the Sun King, Louis XIV. Napoleon's military successes and his status as one of history's greatest marshals were not due to him creating a revolution in the military field. There was no revolutionary technological difference between the Napoleonic Wars and the endless Anglo-French conflicts of the 18th century. However, his tactical genius in managing great pitched battles would make him nearly unique in human history. In fact, Napoleon never radically changed military literature by making revolutionary changes in terms of army equipment, hardware, weaponry, or management. But he perfected the art of war in its existing form and achieved formidable victories by combining superior intellectual intelligence with leadership skills. Napoleon possessed an immense work capacity. He could work 18 to 20 hours a day without interruption. It is even known that the emperor could occasionally work for 3 days straight, and then continue working after falling into a few hours of sleep. His memory and mastery of detail were beyond measure. Let me recount an instance. For example, in 1805, a unit within the French army marching toward Austria lost communication with its own commander and Napoleon's headquarters. In this period, managing a large army and ensuring coordination between units was a very difficult task. Communication between units was generally provided by mounted couriers. While the unit's commander and Napoleon's staff spent hours searching through maps and written orders to find where this division-sized unit of 7,000 men could be, the emperor noticed the confusion. Napoleon calmly took the floor with a level of detail that would embarrass his staff and the unit's commander. He summarized in a few sentences exactly where the unit was, which direction it had been marching for the last 3 days, which point it would reach within 3 days, its current strength, number of soldiers, and the specific count of cavalry and artillery. Considering that Napoleon commanded 7 corps consisting of exactly 200,000 men during the 1805 Austrian campaign, this example shows to what extent he mastered the details. He would plan a military operation months in advance, with all its logistical requirements. At the beginning of the 19th century, Armies progressed by marching, followed by massive columns of horse-drawn wagons carrying ammunition, fodder, and food. This gave a tremendous advantage to the side defending its own territory with fortified positions. Even during the peak of the French Empire, Napoleon was almost always at a numerical disadvantage. Despite this, he possessed the skill to win crushing victories in the heart of rival nations. It was this immense tactical genius that would overshadow Napoleon's strategic weaknesses, and those strategic deficiencies would eventually collapse the vast empire stretching from Spain to the Russian steppes. Let us begin examining Napoleon's amazing story together. As the 18th century drew to a close, the French Revolution had lost its momentum after 10 years of chaos, along with the anarchy and disorder it had created. While French armies, fueled by the spirit of patriotism and nationalism ignited by the French Revolution, achieved successive victories against coalition armies in Italy and on the Flanders and Meuse fronts, the young general of the Italian and Egyptian campaigns first became first consul, November 9, 1799, and later Emperor of the French, Empereur des Français, December 2, 1804. While the military leadership Napoleon exhibited during the Italian campaign was a harbinger of his formidable successes in the coming years, his ability to transform the French Republic into the First French Empire between 1799 and 1804 would underscore Napoleon's political ambition and skill. Napoleon had learned a good lesson from history. At the core of his political ascent, he had carefully studied and applied all the teachings left to history by the Roman consul and Rome's unforgettable general, Julius Caesar, and his immediate successor, his nephew and adopted son, the first Roman emperor, Octavius Augustus. Just as the Roman Republic transformed into the Roman Empire, Napoleon first ensured the collapse of the weak and corrupt Directory administration of the French Republic, and turned the succeeding triumvirate of the consulate into an empire. Note that Napoleon Bonaparte did not traditionally crown himself King of France, Roi de France. He took the title Emperor of the French, and thus wisely utilized the legacy of the French Revolution. The imperial emphasis was directed toward the French colonies and the lands France had newly acquired in Europe. Much later, when the King of Prussia was crowned in 1871 at Versailles as the Emperor of United Germany, he would reproach the architect of United Germany, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, for being crowned as the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser von Deutschland. The new emperor had Napoleon Bonaparte's title in mind and hoped to be crowned as the Emperor of the Germans, Kaiser der Deutschen. I will explain the meaning and purpose of Bismarck's formidable maneuver later. Now, let's take a break from Napoleon's story and examine together some critical events that took place during this period, the effects of which are still felt today. The Haitian Revolution, started by slaves in 1791, is an important turning point where a colony gained its independence for the first time. Haiti gained its independence from the French Republic through this rebellion. This slave revolt is the largest since the Spartacus Revolt that shook the Roman Republic to its foundations. And with the success of this revolt and the beginning of the Industrial Revolutions, the British Empire would prohibit slavery within its own realm in 1807. Thus, slavery, a concept as old as human history, would now steadily decline. Another important event is the purchase of the Louisiana Territory by the young American Republic from the French Republic in 1803. Napoleon calculated that he could not hold this region in North America, which was approximately 2.1 million square kilometers in size, due to the Haitian Revolution and the undisputed superiority of the British Navy. Moreover, it was not possible to forcibly remove the American immigrants who had begun to settle in this massive area, and Napoleon also needed money for the upcoming new war. Additionally, the American administration was highly interested in this vast region because the Mississippi River was an important waterway and had entered into a search for an alliance with their old enemies, the British, against France to seize the region. Napoleon resolved this complication by selling the region to the Americans for $15 million. After all, while the French controlled part of the region, American Indians lived in most of it. No one cared about the Native Americans. The young American Republic had instantly doubled the land it owned. Now the borders of the U.S. reached the Rocky Mountains in the west. Let us note that 13 states are located in this massive region today. With the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, the U.S. would later expand toward the Pacific Ocean and set its sights on the vast lands owned by Spain and later Mexico in the south. After evaluating these extraordinary events together, let us return to the Napoleonic Wars. It had become clear that the Peace of Amiens, which ended the French Revolutionary Wars, 1792 to 1802, would not last long. While Napoleon increased his influence over Switzerland, German principalities, the Netherlands, and Italy, and established regimes loyal to him in these regions, the British declared war in May 1803. The British had formed a formidable coalition, the Third Coalition, against France, with the Holy Roman Empire led by Austria, the Russian Empire, Sweden, and the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily. Let us note that the First and Second Coalitions were formed during the French Revolutionary Wars. Prussia remained neutral. While the British blockaded French ports to collapse the French economy, the French Navy, whose ships were scattered across ports and trying to come together, was dealt a massive defeat at Trafalgar in October 1805. However, the French army, commanded by Napoleon himself, won a formidable victory by defeating the Austrians at Ulm in October 1805, and the Austro-Russian imperial armies at Austerlitz in December 1805. This conflict is called the Battle of the Three Emperors. When British Prime Minister Pitt learned how decisive and terrifying the defeat of his allies was, he would say, "Roll up that map of Europe. It will not be wanted these 10 years." Unlike the wars of the 18th century, for the first time, the capital of a major power would be invaded. Together with Ulm and Austerlitz, Vienna would fall within 3 months. With Trafalgar, Ulm, and Austerlitz, the situation of the British and the French became like a whale and an elephant. One was the master of the seas, the other of the continent. Although the British land force was laughably small, its naval power was strong enough to suffocate the ports of France and its allies with a blockade. With Austerlitz, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine within the borders of present-day Germany. With the establishment of this satellite confederation, Austria and Prussia were no longer in a position to interfere in the affairs of small German states and principalities. The Holy Roman Empire, 962 to 1806, which had long since become an antique, disappeared. The Austrians also lost their last territories in Italy. The remnants of the Russian army were allowed to return to Russia. The war was not over. In 1806, this time the British Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Sweden, the Kingdom of Sicily, and Saxony formed the Fourth Coalition against France and its allies. Napoleon aimed to crush Prussia, which had the strongest army in the coalition, before the Russians could mobilize their armies. As Napoleon advanced into present-day Germany, he would devastate the Prussian armies at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, both on October 14, 1806. Prussia, which possessed the most perfect military mechanism in Europe, was also devastated. The Prussian capital, Berlin, would fall on October 27, 1806. Napoleon's next target was the Russian armies. After the inconclusive battle at Eylau, February 7, 1807, upon reaching Poland, the French routed the remaining Russian armies at Friedland, June 14, 1807. The Russian Tsar also sued for peace. The battles of Ulm, Austerlitz, Jena Auerstedt, and Friedland were the colossal battles of the period. These 4 battles were ones where the French armies, fighting far from their logistical bases and possessing a numerical disadvantage, created miracles through Napoleon's own military skill. Now Britain was alone against France. Its former allies, Austria and Prussia, had been catastrophically defeated, their capitals occupied, and they subsequently became Napoleon's reluctant allies against Britain. Russia also joined the ranks of France's reluctant allies after Friedland. Prussia had lost half of its pre-war territory. France and the satellite states it established now controlled a massive area from the Portuguese border to present-day eastern Poland. However, the British Empire was still a problem with its navy. Napoleon's counterweapon against this reality would be the armed counter-blockade he named the Continental System, Blocus Continental. No British goods would be allowed into continental Europe, and even postal communications would be prohibited. This system had two objectives. The first was to collapse the British economy, which was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the second was to establish a single, duty-free, and integrated market in continental Europe, dominated by France. Thus, the theory of the structure that would later transform into the European Economic Community, and subsequently the European Union, was put into practice by Napoleon 135 years ago. The Continental System did not only cover France and its allies. Britain's former allies, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, were also forced to enter the system as the price of making peace. The Continental System would initially cause immense damage to Britain. While Britain's exports to continental Europe fell, British merchants would have to make an incredible effort to find new markets. The memories of the counter-blockades would focus Britain on acquiring more colonies throughout the century, and would also trigger the acquisition of increasing levels of permanent British privileges in countries such as China and the Ottoman Empire. Further advancing the Continental System, Napoleon would characterize any country's ship that docked at British ports or paid customs duties to Britain as a British ship. While the young American Republic was an important raw material supplier for Britain, American cotton no longer reached British ports. Tensions would rise between the U.S. and Britain, and a war would break out between the two countries in 1812, while the Napoleonic Wars were still ongoing. The course of the 3-year war was like the movement of a yo-yo. Not only were the Americans unsuccessful in invading British Canada, but the capital Washington and the White House would be occupied and burned by the British on August 24, 1814. The course of the Napoleonic Wars would bring the parties to the peace table. While the Americans agreed with Britain to return to the pre-war situation, status quo ante bellum, what happened would be to the Native American tribes who were allies of the British. The Continental System and bringing Britain to its knees had become Napoleon's obsession. With this obsession, the insistence on including Portugal in the system led to a major strategic error. While the French were trying to bring Portugal to its knees, everything happened when they launched an offensive through Spain. Although Spain was once one of the great powers, it was now a middleweight country that was a satellite of France. However, when Napoleon deposed the Spanish king, the Spanish people began an irregular war against the French soldiers. The term guerrilla warfare originates from here. The war in Spain and Portugal, or better known as the Peninsular War, would last a full 7 years, 1807 to 1814, and tie down approximately 300,000 French troops. Meanwhile, the Peninsular War would encourage Austria to enter the War of the Fifth Coalition, 1809, alongside Britain. After Napoleon tasted his first defeat at Aspern-Essling in May 1809, he would devastate the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram, July 5th to 6th, 1809, and force them back into peace. Austria's remaining lands in Germany and Italy would be given to France's satellites. With Russia's exit from the Continental System in 1810, Napoleon would cast all his dice at once. On June 24, 1812, a French army of approximately 600,000 men entered Russia and, after many battles, began a slow and exhausting march toward Moscow. In essence, Napoleon was no longer the old Napoleon. His health had deteriorated, and he had gained a fair amount of weight. The Russian campaign was not well planned, especially from a logistical perspective. Finding burned fields and emptied villages as it advanced into Russia, the Grande Armée lost half of its strength within the very first week. Although the Russians were defeated at the Battle of Smolensk, the inconclusive Battle of Borodino was a disaster for both armies. With a clever strategy, the Russians avoided entering into a large-scale pitched battle against Napoleon and tried to wear down the French army with small engagements. Entering Moscow on September 14, 1812, the French would face an emptied city, fire, and famine. It was impossible for the army to winter in Moscow. Forced to retreat, the Grande Armée would lose approximately 400,000 soldiers, 150,000 horses, and 1,050 cannons throughout the entire campaign. Moreover, following this massive defeat, Austria and Prussia also declared war on France, the War of the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon would display immense leadership in the War of the Sixth Coalition. He repeatedly defeated the coalition forces in battles within Germany against the numerically and technologically far superior forces of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, Austria, and numerous former satellite states. Despite his exhausted army, Napoleon was still a very dangerous opponent. The coalition forces, even as late as 1813, preferred to fight the armies of Napoleon's marshals without facing the army commanded by Napoleon himself. Napoleon devastated the coalition forces at Lutzen, May 2, 1813, and Dresden, August 26 to 27, 1813. But in the Battle of Leipzig, October 16 to 19, 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations, even Napoleon's genius was not in a position to rectify such a vast inequality. After the Battle of Leipzig, it was the final act of the play for Napoleon. Moreover, the Peninsular War was now lost, and the Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese coalition, reaching the Pyrenees Mountains, had begun directly invading southern France. Although Napoleon fought very successful defensive wars in Germany and France with his finished and exhausted army after Leipzig, France's fate was now certain. Paris surrendered on March 30th to 31st, 1814, and the emperor abdicated the throne. I will not recount at length Napoleon's return to Paris in 1815, after going into exile on Elba, his restarting the War of the Seventh Coalition, and his ultimate defeat at Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Even if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo, it would have been impossible for him to achieve victory against the new and massive armies that the coalition forces would have put before him. The fate of the war had been decided years earlier. This time, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a British colony off the coast of Africa, approximately 2,000 kilometers away. He would never see France or his soldiers again. After about 6 years of captivity, he would lose his life on May 5, 1821, at only 51 years of age, from stomach cancer, or, according to one theory, arsenic poisoning. His final words were, France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine. France, the army, head of the army, and Josephine. He had never been able to forget his former wife, Empress Josephine. They had divorced by mutual agreement because they could not have children together, and at the official divorce ceremony on January 10, 1810, both had clearly expressed their devotion to each other. When Josephine died in 1814, while Napoleon was in exile on Elba, the emperor was plunged into great grief, and this immense sorrow would last until the emperor's death. Napoleon had married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise on March 11, 1810. Their son from this marriage would die 11 years after his father, at age 21, without having commanded a single soldier. But Napoleon's lineage would continue in an unexpected way through Josephine. Josephine's daughter from her first marriage, Hortense de Beauharnais, would marry Napoleon's brother, and Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte would be born from this marriage. Charles Louis, who was Napoleon's nephew by his brother and the son of his stepdaughter by his first wife, would become the first president of France after the 1848 Revolution, and later the second emperor, and would be known as Napoleon III. His former empress, Josephine, whom he could never forget, had not been able to give him a direct heir, but Josephine's grandson much later continued Napoleon's name as an emperor. Napoleon III was not as brilliant a statesman as his uncle. Due to a critical mistake he made, France would fall for Bismarck's game, and United Germany would be born in 1871 in the famous Hall of Mirrors at France's Palace of Versailles. With Napoleon's exile, the New World Order would be shaped by the Vienna system, the Industrial Revolution, and the classical economics teachings of Adam Smith and his successors, lasting until World War I, which began on July 28, 1914. The next episode of the Story of the Global World Order video series will be the Vienna Order. Do not miss the story of this new era, one of the most turbulent and transformative chapters in history. To experience history through immersive visuals, follow, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Like if you enjoyed this journey. Remember, latet enim veritas, sed nihil pretiosius veritate. Have a day full of learning.